The white cop leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an arrogant smirk stretched across his face as he looked at the black woman standing in the courtroom. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his confidence was unshaken. To him, this was just another day, another case, another black person trying to fight a system designed to keep people like her exactly where he thought they belonged, beneath him. He had seen it 1,000 times before. They always came in, all righteous, all loud about justice and fairness, but in the end, the law was always on his side. And today wouldn't be any different. He had the power. He had the authority. And no one, not this woman, not any lawyer, not even a judge, was going to change that. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as he whispered to the officer next to him. Another one crying racism. They never learn, do they? Always playing the victim, always thinking they're special, he scoffed, voice laced with mockery. They get pulled over, break the law, and then when we do our jobs, suddenly it's a race thing. Unbelievable. The woman stood firm, her posture poised, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't react to his words, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. There was no anger on her face, no desperation, no fear, nothing that he expected. That alone irritated him. He was used to seeing them scared, broken, defeated. But she just stood there, silent, composed, unshaken. And that infuriated him. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see her beg. He wanted her to look at him with the same helplessness that he had seen in so many before her. Instead, she simply watched, as if waiting, as if she already knew something he didn't. And that, for the briefest moment, sent an unease crawling up his spine. But he shook it off. He was in control here. He always was. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to read the verdict, but the cop wasn't done. He leaned forward now, his smirk widening as he locked eyes with the woman. "What's wrong?" he taunted, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Not so tough now, huh? You should have just stayed quiet back there. You think making a scene was gonna change anything? You think yelling about your rights was gonna save you? Please. You people always think you're above the law, but let me tell you something, sweetheart, when I put those cuffs on you, it didn't matter who you were. And guess what? It still doesn't." A few muffled gasps rippled through the room, but he didn't care. He was enjoying this too much. He had dragged her out of her car, shoved her against the hood, ignored her protests, her demands to see his badge number. He had laughed when she told him she would make sure he paid for this. Paid for what? Doing his job. They always said the same thing, and nothing ever happened. He had tossed her in the back of his squad car like a piece of trash, knowing she would sit there for hours, helpless, humiliated. He had been doing this for years, and no one had ever stopped him before. Why would today be any different? The judge straightened his papers, glanced at the woman, then turned his gaze toward the cop. His face remained unreadable as he lifted his gavel slightly, letting the room settle into an uneasy silence. Then, in a voice firm and unwavering, he spoke words that shattered the arrogance off the cop's face in an instant. "Please rise, for governor." The silence was deafening. The smirk disappeared. The color drained from the cop's face. His arms, once confidently crossed, slowly unfolded. His body stiffened. His jaw clenched. His throat went dry. "Governor? No. No, that couldn't be right. That wasn't possible." His chest tightened, his heartbeat pounded against his ribs like a war drum as the reality of what had just been said sunk into his bones. His eyes darted toward the woman, the one he had arrested, the one he had mocked, the one he had humiliated in front of his entire department. And she was just standing there, expression unchanged, calm as ever, watching him, waiting for him to put the pieces together. Governor. Not a nobody. Not just some woman. Not just another case. She was the governor of the entire state. He had arrested the most powerful woman in the room. And now everyone knew. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled into a storm. People turned their heads, eyes widening as they registered what had just happened. Some gasped. Some whispered. Some barely contained their shock. The reporters in the back scrambled to write, cameras flashing as the realization spread like wildfire. The cop's hands clenched into fists, sweat pooling at the nape of his neck. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had nothing to say. What could he say? He had humiliated her, disrespected her, treated her like dirt beneath his boots, and she outranked everyone in this damn courthouse. His mind raced. This is a joke. This has to be some kind of mistake. There's no way but he knew. He knew it wasn't a mistake. He could see it in the way the judge looked at him now. In the way the lawyers whispered among themselves. In the way the woman, Governor, stood there, still poised, still composed, completely in control. And for the first time in his entire career, he felt something he had never felt before. Fear. A cold, paralyzing, gut-wrenching fear. He had mocked her. Laughed at her. Dragged her in handcuffs in front of dozens of people. He had violated her rights on camera. He had abused his power in front of witnesses. And now she had the power. The air in the room thickened. He could feel the weight of every single pair of eyes pressing down on him, suffocating him, waiting for his reaction. Waiting to see him squirm. But the worst part? She hadn't even spoken yet. She hadn't said a single word. And yet, he already knew, his life was over. What happened next, left everyone in that courtroom absolutely speechless. Before we dive into this powerful story, we want to take a moment to say something important. Plow of Twist stands firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a place where we tell stories that expose injustice, highlight resilience, and celebrate triumph over oppression. To every black viewer watching this, you are powerful. You are valuable. You deserve respect, dignity, and justice. This story is for you. Now, get ready for a mind-blowing twist that will leave you speechless. If you enjoy deep, emotional, and unpredictable stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Now, let's get into it. Enjoy the story. The air inside the courtroom was heavy, thick with the quiet tension that only a high-stakes trial could bring. The walls, adorned with aged wooden panels, bore the weight of centuries of justice and injustice alike. The American flag stood tall behind the judge's bench, motionless, unwavering, a silent observer to the countless lives that had been altered in this very room. The audience was a mix of attorneys, reporters, and curious onlookers, their faces a blend of anticipation and muted whispers as they watched the proceedings unfold. But among them, one man sat with a smirk carved into his face, his presence oozing arrogance as if he were untouchable. Detective Daniel Calloway was a man who carried himself with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never faced consequences. His uniform was immaculate, his posture relaxed, his demeanor that of a man who had spent years knowing that the system worked in his favor. A veteran of the force, he had climbed the ranks not through merit, but through carefully cultivated connections and an uncanny ability to manipulate the very laws he was sworn to uphold. His peers admired him, his superiors tolerated him, and those beneath him feared him. He had seen officers get caught up in scandals, lose their badges, get dragged into legal battles that ended their careers, but not him. Daniel Calloway knew how to play the game. He had spent years policing in a way that kept certain communities under his control. He had made arrests that never should have happened, falsified reports that covered up his own misconduct, and wielded his badge like a weapon rather than a shield. But what made him truly dangerous was the smirk, the unwavering, cocky expression that never left his face, no matter the situation. It was a smirk that said, "You can't touch me." And today, sitting comfortably in the courtroom, it was plastered on his face as he watched the woman at the center of it all. Amara Williams stood tall, her presence commanding the room in a way that needed no words. She had been here before, not in this exact position, but in rooms filled with men like Calloway. Men who underestimated her, men who saw her as nothing more than a black woman who didn't know her place. She had spent her entire career breaking barriers, shattering expectations, proving time and time again that she was more than the labels placed upon her. From a young girl growing up in the heart of Atlanta to the woman standing in the center of the courtroom, every battle she had fought had prepared her for this moment. She had once believed in the system, had once thought that justice was something everyone had equal access to. That belief had been stripped away over the years, chipped at by every case she had handled, every person she had defended who had been wronged by people like Calloway. She had seen families torn apart, men falsely imprisoned, women brutalized, all at the hands of those who were meant to protect them. And yet, here she was, staring down the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the system. Daniel Calloway had arrested her days ago in what should have been a routine traffic stop. It had been late at night, the streets mostly empty, when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She had pulled over immediately, her hands gripping the wheel, her breath steady. She had been through this before. She knew the drill. She rolled down her window before he even approached, kept her hands visible, her movements deliberate. But Calloway hadn't asked for her license or registration. He hadn't approached with protocol in mind. He had walked up to her car with that smirk already in place, his hand resting on his holster, his eyes scanning her with the lazy indifference of a man who had already made up his mind. "Step out of the vehicle," he had said, his tone devoid of courtesy, heavy with entitlement. She had questioned him, politely, firmly, but the response had been instant aggression. Within minutes, she had been yanked from her car, her wrist twisted behind her back, the cold metal of handcuffs snapping against her skin. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't fought back. But that hadn't stopped him from shoving her against the hood of the car, pressing his weight into her as if she were some kind of threat. He had called her aggressive, had accused her of resisting, words that had been used far too many times against people like her. By the time she had been thrown into the back of the squad car, she hadn't said a word. Not because she was afraid, not because she had been defeated, but because she knew something that Calloway did not. And now, days later, as she stood in the courtroom with the entire world watching, that knowledge remained her weapon. Calloway leaned over to his fellow officer, whispering something under his breath, another smug remark, another attempt to assert his dominance. He was relaxed. Confident. Unbothered. Because in his mind, this was nothing more than another case that would disappear, another complaint that wouldn't go anywhere. He had been through this before. He had walked into courtrooms just like this one, sat in that very seat, heard accusations that would never stick. As far as he was concerned, today would be no different. The judge adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat as he prepared to address the room. The tension was palpable, a storm waiting to break. Amara remained still, her face unreadable, her hands resting at her sides. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to argue. Because the moment the judge opened his mouth, everything changed. Calloway's smirk faltered for the first time. The room held its breath. Amara watched as realization dawned on him, as the blood drained from his face, as the weight of what was happening settled in his chest like a stone. She had waited for this moment. And now, the man who had spent years making people feel small, who had laughed in her face as he shoved her into the back of a police car, who had never once believed that he would face consequences, was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Because today, for the first time in his life, Daniel Calloway was not the one in control. And what happened next would leave everyone in that courtroom utterly speechless. The courtroom was drowning in a silence so thick it felt suffocating. Daniel Calloway's smirk had vanished completely, leaving behind a pale, frozen mask of disbelief. He had leaned forward slightly when the judge spoke, as if he hadn't heard the words correctly, as if his mind refused to process them. But there was no mistake. No misunderstanding. The woman standing before him, the one he had humiliated, mocked, and arrested without cause, was not just some ordinary citizen crying about her rights. She was Governor Amara Williams. A flicker of movement caught his eye, reporters shifting in their seats, pens scratching frantically across their notepads, capturing every detail of this unfolding disaster. The cameras in the back clicked relentlessly, their flashes casting sharp bursts of light over his now rigid form. He could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes drilling into him, every gaze a silent judgment, a realization sweeping through the room like wildfire. He wasn't untouchable anymore. Amara, on the other hand, remained perfectly still, her face composed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't gloating, wasn't throwing back the same mockery he had given her. That would have been too easy. No, she let the moment stretch, let him stew in his own fear, let the silence do the work. And it did. Because there was nothing more terrifying to a man like Calloway than losing control. The judge cleared his throat again, shuffling some papers, his voice carrying a quiet authority. Governor Williams, do you wish to proceed? Amara finally moved, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, dangerously so. I do. Calloway's mouth was dry. His hands, which had been comfortably folded, were now gripping the edge of the table in front of him. He felt the heat rising up his neck, spreading to his ears. His mind was screaming at him to do something, say something, regain control of the situation, but for the first time in his life, he didn't know how. His attorney, Mark Hollis, shifted beside him, clearly just as rattled. Hollis was a seasoned defense lawyer, a man who had built his career on getting cops like Calloway out of trouble. But even he looked unsure now. He leaned in slightly, voice low. We need to regroup. This is bad. Calloway barely heard him. His pulse was pounding in his ears. He had walked into this courtroom believing this would be nothing more than a formality. That the case would be dismissed, that his record would remain spotless, that he'd walk out of here the same way he always did, victorious. But that was before he knew who he was up against. Amara turned her gaze toward him now, locking eyes with him for the first time since he had shoved her into the back of his squad car. There was no anger in her expression, no visible fury, just an unsettling calm. And somehow, that was worse. You don't seem as confident as you did that night, detective, she said smoothly, her voice carrying just enough volume that everyone could hear. I wonder why that is. Calloway's lips parted, but no words came. The courtroom remained on edge, the anticipation hanging like a storm about to break. The judge gestured toward the prosecution, signaling for them to begin, and that was when Calloway felt it, the first real crack in the foundation beneath his feet. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa Monroe, stood and adjusted her blazer, her movements precise and controlled. She approached the center of the room with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who already knew the outcome of the battle before it even began. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, Monroe began, we are here today to address a grave abuse of power. An abuse committed not against a stranger, not against some faceless citizen, but against the very leader of our state. A woman who was unlawfully detained, humiliated, and treated as if she had no rights, simply because one officer believed he could do so without consequence. She let the words settle before turning, her sharp gaze locking onto Calloway. Detective Calloway has a long history of complaints against him. Complaints that, until now, have been conveniently buried under bureaucracy and institutional protection. But today, that protection ends. Today, we bring those actions to light. Calloway's lawyer immediately stood, already in damage control mode. Objection. This is prejudicial, overruled, the judge interrupted swiftly. Proceed. Monroe nodded, taking a step closer toward the jury, her expression one of cold calculation. We have dashcam footage of the unlawful arrest. We have bodycam footage that mysteriously malfunctioned during crucial moments. We have witnesses who saw exactly how Detective Calloway conducted himself. And we have the testimony of Governor Williams herself. Calloway's stomach twisted violently. Dashcam footage. He had been careful. He always was. But then again, he had never thought to cover his tracks in a case like this. He hadn't known who she was. And now, that mistake was about to cost him everything. His attorney shifted beside him again, leaning in. Stay calm. We can challenge this. The footage doesn't, but Calloway wasn't listening. His mind was racing, clawing for an escape, an excuse, anything that could undo the mess he had walked into. He had connections. He had people who owed him favors. He could fix this. He had to fix this. Amara's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. Tell me, detective, she said, tilting her head slightly, her eyes unreadable, do you remember what you said to me that night? When you slammed me against my own car? When you laughed in my face? Calloway's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what she was referring to. He had said a lot of things that night, things he had said to countless others before her. But this time, those words weren't going to disappear into some forgotten report. This time, the entire courtroom was waiting to hear him answer for them. She took another step closer, her voice lowering just enough to make the room lean in. You told me I was nothing, she said. That I didn't matter. That my title, my career, my very existence meant nothing when faced with your authority. She let the words hang between them, let them linger in the air like poison. Then, she smiled, just slightly, just enough to make his blood run cold. And yet, here we are, she said. And suddenly, I matter quite a bit. Calloway's chest tightened, his breath shallow. He could feel the walls closing in around him. He had always thought himself untouchable. Always believed the system would protect him. But now, sitting in this courtroom, facing down the very woman he had tried to strip of her dignity, he knew, this time, there would be no way out. And what was coming next, was going to be worse than anything he had ever imagined. The weight of the courtroom bore down on Daniel Calloway like a crushing force, suffocating and inescapable. The once arrogant detective, the man who had walked into this building with the certainty of his own invincibility, now sat frozen, his body rigid, his mind a whirlwind of panic. The murmurs that had filled the room earlier had died down to an almost unbearable silence, the kind that made every breath feel deafening, every shift in movement amplified. He could feel the sweat at the base of his neck, the tightening in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was not how things worked. Across from him, Governor Amara Williams remained composed, her expression revealing nothing but quiet, deliberate control. She had never raised her voice, never shown even a flicker of outward emotion, and yet she had already dismantled every ounce of power Calloway once believed he held. Her presence alone was a force he had never anticipated, a reckoning he had never prepared for. And now, as she took another step forward, all the confidence he had carried his entire career evaporated like mist in the sunlight. Lisa Monroe, the lead prosecutor, didn't hesitate as she moved toward the judge's bench, a folder in her hands, thick with evidence that would be impossible to deny. She placed it down with an audible thud, the sound cutting through the air like a warning bell. Your Honor, Monroe's voice carried the weight of finality, what we have here is not just a case of misconduct. This is systemic abuse, covered up time and time again by procedural loopholes and internal protection. But today, those walls come down. Calloway's throat felt tight, his muscles wound so tense he could barely move. Monroe turned to the jury, her gaze piercing, unwavering. Detective Calloway abused his badge. Not once. Not twice. But repeatedly, for years. We have reports that were dismissed without investigation, complaints that disappeared before reaching internal affairs, body cam footage that conveniently malfunctioned. And it would have happened again if he had not made one crucial mistake. She glanced at Amara, then back at Calloway, before speaking the words that made his stomach drop. He didn't know who he was arresting. The quiet hum of voices swelled again, the realization settling deeper into every corner of the courtroom. Calloway's lawyer, Mark Hollis, adjusted his tie, his face a mask of barely concealed frustration. He had defended officers in difficult positions before, but this was different. This was unwinnable. He leaned toward Calloway, his voice a hushed warning. "We can still try to cut a deal. Reduce sentencing. If you cooperate." Calloway barely heard him. His mind was unraveling at a dizzying pace. Monroe continued, her next move calculated, merciless. The prosecution submits Exhibit A into evidence, the unedited dashcam footage from the night of the arrest. The screen in the courtroom lit up. Calloway's heartbeat thundered in his ears as the video played. The moment flashed to life, him standing outside Amara's car, the way he yanked open the door before she could even speak, the way his voice carried that same smug tone he had always used when he thought he had the upper hand. "Step out of the car, now." Amara's voice, calm yet firm, responded. "On what grounds, officer?" Calloway's response was immediate, laced with impatience and condescension. "Because I said so." The video kept playing, showing the moment he grabbed her by the wrist, twisted it behind her back, the sharp clink of the cuffs snapping shut, the way he shoved her forward, ignoring her protests, ignoring her requests for identification, for an explanation. But it was the words that followed next that sealed his fate. "You think you're someone important?" His own voice echoed through the room, filled with mockery. "Out here, you're just another nobody who needs to learn her place." The air in the courtroom shifted, thick with something unspoken, something irreversible. The video ended. Silence. Then Monroe spoke again, each word deliberate, like a final blow. Detective Calloway didn't just violate protocol. He didn't just exercise unnecessary force. He demeaned, belittled, and unlawfully detained the sitting governor of this state. And he did it because he thought she was powerless against him. Calloway felt his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. His fingers curled into fists. This was a nightmare unraveling in real time, a reality he could no longer manipulate. Amara finally spoke again, her tone unwavering. "And now, Detective Calloway, tell me, do I still look like a nobody to you?" The judge turned to Calloway's lawyer. "Mr. Hollis, does the defense have anything to say before we proceed with sentencing recommendations?" Hollis hesitated. There was nothing left to argue. No way to twist the truth. Before he could respond, Calloway did something no one expected. He stood. The entire courtroom tensed, eyes locking onto him as he straightened his posture, forcing some of the rigidity back into his body, as if attempting to grasp at whatever dignity he had left. His gaze met Amara's, but the smirk, the arrogance, the untouchable confidence, was gone. For the first time in his life, he had no words. And the realization was written all over his face. His downfall was complete. But what happened next, left the entire courtroom in absolute shock. The weight of the courtroom pressed down like an iron grip, suffocating in its intensity. Daniel Calloway stood there, his face stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him, his eyes flickering with something unrecognizable, something raw. His throat was dry, his pulse an unrelenting hammer inside his chest. The silence that followed the video was the kind that drowned a man, left him gasping for air, reaching for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. No badge, no authority, no system to protect him now. The judge watched him carefully, his expression impassive, waiting to see what Calloway would do next. The jury, the audience, even the other officers in the room were waiting. Some looked at him with disdain, others with morbid curiosity. But the one gaze that burned through him the most was hers. Amara Williams had not looked away. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking, unwavering. She had faced men like him her whole life, men who thought they were untouchable, men who wielded power like a weapon against those they believed beneath them. But there was something different about this moment. This wasn't just another battle. This was the end of the war. And she had won. For a second, Calloway opened his mouth, as if searching for words, some kind of defense, some kind of excuse that could undo the damage. But nothing came. Because what could he say? What argument could possibly absolve him now? His attorney finally spoke, his voice low, urgent. "Detective, sit down." But Calloway didn't sit. He couldn't. His body refused to obey. His whole life, he had been the one with control, the one who dictated how situations unfolded. And now, for the first time, he was at the mercy of someone else. Amara took a step forward, her voice calm but carrying a weight that sent a chill down his spine. "No more words, detective. No more laughter. No more mockery." Calloway clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. His breath was shallow, uneven. "She didn't let up. You had plenty to say the night you arrested me. Plenty of insults. Plenty of threats. You didn't hesitate to remind me that my life, my title, my very existence meant nothing to you." The courtroom was utterly still. She took another step closer, each movement precise, deliberate. "But here we are now, and suddenly you have nothing to say." His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who you were." A soft laugh left Amara's lips, humorless, cold. "And that's supposed to mean something? That if I had been someone else, someone without power, it would have been acceptable? That what you did to me, what you've done to countless others, is only wrong now because of my title?" Calloway's stomach twisted violently. He knew the answer. They all did. "You've spent years abusing your power," she continued, her voice steady. "And how many times have you walked away? How many times have you laughed at the people you've hurt? How many times have you told yourself that nothing would ever happen to you?" His jaw was so tight it ached. He could feel the sweat at his temples, the heat creeping up his neck. And now, Amara's voice softened, but somehow, that only made it more lethal. "Now, it's happening to you." He swallowed hard. His mind was scrambling, clawing for some way to regain control. He had always known how to manipulate situations, how to twist narratives to his advantage. But there was no way out of this. No technicality to exploit. No lies to spin. The judge finally spoke, his voice firm. "Detective Calloway, do you wish to make a statement before we proceed?" The moment stretched, suffocating in its intensity. He could feel his attorney shifting beside him, waiting, hoping that he wouldn't make things worse for himself. But it didn't matter. Nothing he said could change what was coming. He forced himself to look at Amara, to meet her gaze one last time. And for the first time in his life, he saw himself through someone else's eyes, not as a man in power, not as a respected officer, but as exactly what he was. A coward. His voice was barely audible. "I was wrong." The words felt foreign in his mouth, unnatural. He had never said them before. Never admitted fault. Never acknowledged that he was anything less than untouchable. A slow breath left Amara, her expression unreadable. She studied him for a moment, then tilted her head slightly. "Yes," she said simply. "You were." The judge nodded, turning his attention back to the room. "Very well. Given the overwhelming evidence against the defendant, this court will now move forward with the official sentencing recommendations." Calloway barely registered the words. His world was collapsing, the walls of his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. He had walked into this room as a man who believed he was above the law. He would leave it knowing that, for the first time in his life, he would face the consequences he had spent years avoiding. As the judge began reading the charges, the words blurred together in his mind. His badge, the thing that had given him untouchable power, was gone. His career, his reputation, everything he had built for himself, had disintegrated in a matter of minutes. And Amara Williams? She was still standing. Unshaken. Unbroken. A testament to the fact that justice, no matter how delayed, always found its way to those who thought themselves untouchable. The gavel struck, the final sound sealing his fate. And just like that, Daniel Calloway's reign of impunity was over. The courtroom doors swung open as the gavel's final echo still vibrated through the tense air. The spectators, reporters, and legal officials moved with a slow, deliberate energy, as if processing the gravity of what had just transpired. For many, this was just another case, another name in the endless cycle of legal battles. But for some, this was something else entirely. This was history unfolding. This was the fall of a man who had, for years, embodied the very corruption and impunity that had plagued communities. The weight of it lingered in every breath, in every glance exchanged as people gathered their belongings and whispered amongst themselves. Daniel Calloway remained seated, staring at the table in front of him, unmoving. His mind was a hurricane of thoughts, none of them offering any escape from the reality he now faced. His badge had been his shield, his untouchable armor. Without it, he was exposed. Vulnerable. Just another man in a system that had, until now, always bent in his favor. He had spent his career ensuring that he was on the right side of power, playing the game so well that he had started to believe he was invincible. But power had always been an illusion, and now, the curtain had been ripped away. The judge had spoken, the sentencing process was underway, and the charges against him would ensure that the world would never see him as a hero again. It wasn't just about losing his job, it was about losing everything. His reputation was in ruins. His name, once respected in certain circles, was now synonymous with corruption, brutality, and disgrace. He could already imagine the news headlines, the endless articles detailing his downfall, the footage of his arrest playing on every channel. There would be no escaping it. And worst of all, he knew that beyond the courtroom, beyond the legal ramifications, something else had shifted, something irreversible. The other officers in the room, his so-called colleagues, weren't looking at him the way they once had. There was no silent nod of brotherhood, no reassurance in their expressions. Some of them avoided his gaze entirely, unwilling to be associated with him now that he had become a liability. Others watched him with barely concealed satisfaction, as if relishing the rare sight of someone like him being held accountable. He had never been one to need approval from anyone, his authority had always spoken for itself. But now, stripped of that authority, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Isolation. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, but the moment he had realized who Amara Williams truly was, the walls he had built around himself had crumbled. And now, he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret and the inescapable truth that he had been wrong. Not just about her, but about everything. Amara stood across the room, her posture as steady as it had been from the beginning. She had won this battle without raising her voice, without resorting to the same cruelty he had shown her. That, perhaps, was what unsettled him the most. He had seen what happened to people when they were faced with injustice. He had watched them break, had seen their rage, their helplessness. He had fed off of it, knowing that the system would always protect him. But she had never broken. She had never begged. She had never played into his expectations. And that was why she had won. Lisa Monroe gathered her notes, exchanging a few quiet words with Amara before stepping away. There was nothing left to argue. No defense to mount. The case had spoken for itself. But Amara wasn't finished. She turned toward Calloway, her expression unreadable, and for the first time since the trial had begun, she walked toward him. His body tensed. He didn't know what to expect. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, not without a badge to protect him. He forced himself to lift his gaze as she stopped in front of him, her eyes locked onto his with a quiet intensity that sent a ripple of unease through him. "You spent your entire career believing you were above consequences," she said, her voice even, unwavering. "You thought that power made you untouchable. That men like you could do whatever they wanted without ever having to answer for it. Calloway swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, to fight back in some way. But what argument was left? What justification could erase the damage he had done, not just to her, but to countless others? He had nothing. "You're going to prison," she continued, her words cutting through the thick air between them. "You're going to experience what it's like to be on the other side of that badge. To be powerless in a system that was designed to work against you. I wonder if you'll survive it." His breath hitched, a flicker of fear flashing in his eyes. He knew what happened to cops in prison, especially ones like him. He had thrown men behind bars for years, men who would recognize his face the moment he walked through those gates. Men who would remember every injustice, every humiliation, and who would be all too eager to see the tables turned. Amara studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Then she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "You will have to live with what you've done," she said, her tone softer now, but no less firm. "And when you're sitting in a cell, stripped of everything you thought made you powerful, I want you to ask yourself, was it worth it?" A lump formed in Calloway's throat. He couldn't look away from her. He had never feared anyone before. He had never truly regretted anything. But now, in this moment, with the full force of her words settling into his chest, he felt something close to both. Amara straightened, her expression once again unreadable, before stepping back. She didn't need to say anything else. The damage had been done. The reckoning was complete. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, her presence still commanding, still unshaken. Calloway watched her go, feeling the cold weight of his own downfall pressing heavier with each step she took away from him. This was the end of his reign. The end of everything he had built his identity around. The realization settled deep, an anchor pulling him down into a reality he could no longer escape. And as the doors closed behind her, sealing his fate, he knew with absolute certainty, he would never be the same again. The courtroom emptied slowly, voices murmuring in hushed tones, as if the weight of what had just happened was too heavy to carry at full volume. The reporters were already outside, their cameras ready to capture every detail, every expression, every ripple of consequence that followed the downfall of Detective Daniel Calloway. The once imposing figure of a man who had ruled his precinct with unchecked power now sat slumped at the defense table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't listening to the final movements of the court officials, wasn't registering the papers being shuffled, the conversations between lawyers, the soft click of heels against the polished floor. His world had narrowed to a single, inescapable truth: this was real. He had lost. Lisa Monroe gathered her files, slipping them into her briefcase with the precision of someone who had done this many times before, but even she allowed herself a small exhale as she glanced toward Amara Williams. The governor had remained standing for a few extra seconds, watching Calloway in silence. Not with gloating, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to finality. A battle long fought, finally coming to an end. Calloway felt her presence before he could bring himself to meet her eyes. He expected her to say something more, expected some final strike, some reminder of what had just happened, but instead, she simply looked at him, holding his gaze with something he couldn't quite name. There was no anger there anymore, no fury. Just cold, unwavering certainty. And that, somehow, was worse. "You'll remember this," she said finally, her voice quieter than before but just as firm. "Every time you look in the mirror. Every time someone says your name. Every time you wake up in a place you once thought you were too good for. You will remember this moment." Calloway swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind a storm of thoughts colliding with one another, none of them offering any escape. He had always assumed he would go out on his own terms, retire with honor, with his name intact, his legacy unquestioned. Instead, he was being stripped of everything, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the bare truth of what he had done. Monroe shut her briefcase with a soft snap and turned toward Amara. We should go. Reporters are waiting outside. Amara nodded, but before she turned, she took one last look at Calloway, tilting her head slightly as she spoke again. I used to think men like you would never face consequences, she said. But I was wrong. You thought power would protect you forever. That the system would keep you safe. But you never understood something, did you? Calloway clenched his jaw, his fingers pressing into the table so hard they ached. Power shifts, Amara said, her voice steady. And when it does, men like you fall the hardest. The words landed like a punch to his gut, and before he could even begin to process them, she turned and walked away, her strides unhurried, unbothered. She had already won. There was nothing more to say. The door swung shut behind her, sealing her exit, and for the first time since the trial began, Calloway was alone. Not physically, his lawyer was still beside him, officers stood by, waiting to escort him out, but in every way that mattered, he was alone. The realization sank deep into his bones, an ache that had nothing to do with the cold air or the fluorescent lights overhead. It was the kind of loneliness that came from knowing he had done this to himself. Hollis finally spoke, his voice low, measured. They're going to process you today. You'll be taken into holding while they finalize the sentencing details. Calloway barely reacted. The words felt distant, like echoes from another world. Daniel, Hollis pressed, his voice carrying a rare edge. You need to prepare yourself. There's not going to be a way out of this. For so long, Calloway had believed he was untouchable, that no matter how many lines he crossed, there would always be someone willing to protect him. But that was over now. There would be no colleagues pulling strings, no favors called in, no system bending to accommodate him. He had become the thing he had always dismissed, the example. The officers moved toward him, their expressions unreadable, professional. One of them, a man he had worked with before, hesitated just slightly before speaking. Time to go. Calloway exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stand. He kept his back straight, his shoulders squared, but the weight pressing against him was suffocating. He had led men into courtrooms like this before, had walked them through the very same doors he was now being led toward. He had smirked when he saw them shackled, had laughed at their pleas, had never once considered that one day, he would be in their place. The irony was brutal. As he stepped forward, the cuffs clicked around his wrists, cold metal against his skin. He had fastened them on others 1,000 times before, had heard that same click and never thought twice about it. But now, it was different. Now, it wasn't the sound of control, it was the sound of finality. The doors opened, and the light from outside spilled in, blinding for a second. The sound of cameras flashing, reporters shouting, people pushing forward to catch a glimpse of him, was overwhelming. He had once basked in attention like this, had loved the way his name commanded respect. Now, his name was spat out in disgust, printed in bold headlines alongside words like disgraced and corrupt. He stepped through the doors, the cold air hitting his skin, the city stretched out before him as he was led toward the awaiting vehicle. People watched, their faces a mixture of vindication and shock. Some shook their heads, others whispered to each other. But no one looked at him the way they once had. He was no longer the man they had feared. No longer the man they respected. He was just another criminal in cuffs. And as he was placed inside the car, the door slamming shut behind him, he realized that this moment, this downfall, this reckoning, was only the beginning. The ride to the detention center was suffocatingly silent. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the occasional crackle of the radio, and the muffled voices of officers speaking in low tones up front. Daniel Calloway sat in the back, hands cuffed tightly in his lap, the cold steel biting into his wrists. The irony wasn't lost on him. How many times had he thrown men into the back of a car just like this one, not thinking twice about what would come next for them? How many times had he slammed the door shut, ignoring their voices, ignoring their fear, knowing they were headed toward a system designed to break them? But now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one closing the door. He was the one behind it. The car moved through the streets, passing familiar buildings, familiar corners, places he had once walked freely, patrolling like he owned them. He recognized some of the faces on the sidewalks, people looking in as the car passed, their expressions ranging from satisfaction to disbelief. Some held up their phones, recording the moment, capturing the image of a once powerful detective now reduced to nothing more than another criminal in transport. The weight of their stares pressed against him, heavy and suffocating, as if the entire world had turned its gaze toward his downfall. He shifted slightly, his shoulders stiff, the reality of his situation sinking deeper with every passing second. His mind raced, trying to grasp onto something, some way to undo what had already been done. But there was nothing left to hold on to. No allies. No badge. No system bending in his favor. He was truly, irrevocably alone. The officer in the front seat finally spoke, his voice flat, emotionless. "It's going to be a long process for you. Might want to start getting used to it now." Calloway didn't respond. What was there to say? He knew how the system worked. Knew what happened to officers who found themselves on the other side of the bars. He had seen it before, watched from the other side as men like him, men who once walked with power, were stripped down to nothing. The car turned a corner, and the detention center came into view, its towering walls casting a long shadow over the streets below. The entrance was lined with cameras, reporters, people waiting to get the first shot of him being brought inside. The crowd outside had doubled since they left the courthouse, voices rising in anticipation, murmurs turning into shouts as the vehicle slowed to a stop. Officers stepped out first, their movements routine, methodical. Calloway's door opened, and for a moment, he hesitated. Then a hand gripped his arm, pulling him forward, and he stepped out into the cold air. The noise hit him all at once, flashes from cameras, voices calling his name, shouting accusations, demands for justice. Some were jeering, others simply watching, their faces unreadable. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight, his body rigid. He had once been the man walking others through these doors, had once been the one watching from the sidelines as criminals were processed, their dignity stripped away piece by piece. And now, he was the one on display. The officers led him through the doors, into the cold, sterile air of the facility. Inside, everything was stripped of warmth, the walls a dull, lifeless gray, the fluorescent lights casting an unforgiving glow over everything. The process began immediately, shoes removed, belt taken, personal items confiscated. He moved through it mechanically, his mind numb, his body acting on autopilot. Fingerprints. Mugshot. A number assigned where his name once stood. Then came the moment he had been dreading. The holding cell. The door opened, revealing a small, concrete space with a metal bench, the walls bare except for the scratches left behind by those who had been here before him. The officer behind him hesitated for only a moment before gesturing inside. "Step in." Calloway's feet felt like lead, his body unwilling to move, but he forced himself forward. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the empty space. And then, for the first time, he was truly alone. He sat down slowly, his back against the cold wall, staring at nothing. His mind played back every moment that had led him here, every choice, every misstep, every abuse of power he had committed without a second thought. He had believed he was untouchable, had built his entire life around that certainty. And now, he had nothing left but the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. Time passed, though he had no way of measuring how long. The walls didn't move, the air didn't shift. The silence in the cell was suffocating. Then, footsteps. The heavy, deliberate kind. He didn't move, didn't lift his head, until a familiar voice cut through the thick air. "Well," the voice said, slow, controlled. "Isn't this something?" Calloway's head snapped up. The man standing on the other side of the bars was someone he hadn't expected to see, not here, not now. A former inmate, a man he had arrested years ago, a man whose life had been shattered because of him. And now, he was on the outside. While Calloway was in the cell. The man tilted his head slightly, a small, humorless smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Didn't think I'd ever see you in there," he mused. "But damn, life's got a funny way of turning things around, doesn't it?" Calloway didn't answer. His throat was dry, his body stiff. The man leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable. "You remember me, don't you?" "You should. You made sure I spent 6 years in a place just like this. Said I was, exactly where I belonged. Guess that makes 2 of us now, huh?" Calloway felt his stomach tighten, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The man didn't move, didn't break eye contact. "You always thought you were better than the rest of us. Thought that badge made you untouchable. But look at you now. No badge. No gun. No power. Just another man waiting to see what happens next." Calloway's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. Because what could he say? There was no argument left, no defense. Everything the man said was true. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. Then, the man exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I could say a lot right now," he said. "Could throw every word you ever said to me right back in your face. But I don't need to. Because the truth is, you already know." Calloway swallowed hard, his throat burning. The man took a step back, his expression unreadable. "Enjoy your stay, detective." And with that, he walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving Calloway alone once more. But this time, the silence wasn't just suffocating. It was crushing. The world outside moved on, but for Daniel Calloway, time had slowed to a suffocating crawl. Prison was no longer an abstract concept, no longer a threat he had used to keep others in line, it was his reality now. The cold walls, the sterile air, the relentless hum of voices echoing down the corridors, they were all reminders that his old life was gone. He was no longer the man in control, no longer the figure of authority people feared. The uniform, the badge, the power, all of it had been stripped away, leaving behind only a man facing the weight of his own choices. His first night in a cell had been the longest of his life. Sleep was impossible. The darkness pressed against him, heavy with unspoken truths. He had built his career on the suffering of others, believing himself untouchable, believing that justice was whatever he decided it was. But now, he was on the other side of the bars, and the system he had so often manipulated no longer worked in his favor. He had become the very thing he had once despised, a man with no control, no protection, no way out. As the weeks passed, the reality of his situation settled into his bones like a sickness. He was treated like every other inmate, searched, counted, ordered around by guards who barely looked at him. Some recognized him, the ones who had worked cases alongside him, the ones who had once nodded in silent understanding when he bent the rules. But none of them reached out, none of them offered a word of support. He had been one of them once, but now, he was nothing. And the other prisoners, well, they recognized him too. Faces he had arrested, men whose lives he had destroyed, now watched him with knowing eyes. Some smirked. Some whispered. Others simply waited. But there was one person he had been thinking about more than anyone else. Amara Williams. He had never truly understood the power she carried, not just in title, but in presence. She had walked into that courtroom unshaken, undeterred, and left with her head high while he sat in chains. She had not just won the battle, she had dismantled the very foundation of everything he had built his life upon. And yet, as the days passed, he found himself realizing something unsettling. He wasn't angry at her. He should have been. The old version of himself would have been. But now, stripped of his arrogance, his entitlement, he saw the truth for what it was. She hadn't destroyed him. He had done that himself. Months passed. The trial had been over for a long time, but its effects rippled outward, changing everything. The department distanced itself from him, issuing carefully crafted statements about accountability, about reform. Other officers were investigated, some quietly resigning before charges could be brought against them. The culture he had thrived in, the one that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long, was finally beginning to crack. And Amara Williams? She had not wasted a single moment. She used the momentum of the case to push forward changes in legislation, policies that would hold law enforcement accountable in ways they never had been before. She stood at podiums, spoke with clarity and conviction, ensuring that what had happened to her, and to so many others, would not be forgotten. She did not seek revenge. She did not gloat in her victory. She simply did what she had always done, she led. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. Calloway sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the envelope in his hands, his name written in neat, deliberate strokes. He hesitated before opening it, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper inside. It was from her. It wasn't long. It wasn't filled with condemnation or fury. Instead, it was simple. You once told me I was nothing. That my title, my achievements, my very existence meant nothing in the face of your power. But power shifts, Daniel. And the difference between you and me is that I never needed it to define me. Maybe one day, when you've lost everything, you'll understand what that truly means. He read the words over and over, something inside him unraveling with each repetition. He had spent so long believing that strength came from control, from dominance, from bending the world to his will. But Amara had shown him something else. True strength came from resilience. From standing tall even when the world tried to push you down. From knowing who you were, even when others refused to see it. For the first time in his life, he felt the crushing weight of regret. And he knew it was far too late to change what had been done. The years passed, and Daniel Calloway faded from headlines, his name no longer spoken with outrage but with the quiet dismissal reserved for those who had been stripped of significance. He lived his sentence, day by day, watching as the world moved forward without him. He saw the reforms take shape, saw Amara's influence grow, saw the people he once dismissed as powerless finally given the justice they deserved. And though he could never undo the damage he had caused, though he would never again walk as a free man, he understood one thing. Justice had been served. And it had come not in the form of vengeance, but in the unwavering strength of a woman who refused to be silenced. This story isn't just about a corrupt cop getting what he deserved. It's about power, about justice, about what happens when the system finally turns on those who believe themselves untouchable. It's about resilience, about standing up even when the odds are against you. And maybe, most importantly, it's about the truth that power is never permanent, sooner or later, it shifts. What would you have done in Amara's position? Would you have sought revenge? Or would you have chosen justice, knowing that real change comes not from destruction, but from transformation? Let us know in the comments, what was the most powerful moment in this story for you? What did it make you feel? And if you want more stories filled with twists, justice, and the kind of endings that leave you thinking long after they're over, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on notifications. There's always another story waiting, one that just might change the way you see the world. Thanks for watching. And remember, power is fleeting, but justice, real justice, lasts forever.